Gray Stone webinar series. If you've been attending each week, you would be hearing about additional information related to all of us that are dealing with the changes in our world with the COVID-19 situation. Earlier, we've had webinars on the virtual do's and don'ts. We've had the 10 ways that you can maximize callouts and how to create video for websites and Facebook. All of these were adapted to and revolving around the challenging times we're in currently. For today, I will be turning off my video, as I mentioned, and the mics are not accessed right now as well either. So please use the chat button on the bottom of the screen for your questions and your comments. My name is Mary Jane Fitz, and as you can see here, my bio is up on the screen. I've been a part of senior living my whole career, and I want to start by telling you today that there are 3 reasons for that. The first reason was my mother, Hilda, who was diagnosed with Alzheimer's disease. I was in my mid-20s, so it was pretty devastating to me. The other reason really is revolving around the tales of the 2 grandmas. And I'm going to tell you a short story as we get started today, the story of Edna and Ermel. We'll start with Grandma Edna. She lived in Kansas. She lived in a rural town. They were farmers. She lived in 3 centuries. She never had a driver's license, never drove a car, never had a job. She raised her family, took care of the household, and was a very socially engaging person. She died at 104. And most people will say, oh, that's wonderful. She died at home in her sleep, not sick. What a long, wonderful age. Well, I will tell you, in those 104 years, her husband had passed away in his 70s. So she spent 30 plus years alone. And she was a dear person who loved to visit with people and loved to talk. And she got so lonely, but we could not convince her to move to a senior living community that was an hour away. She was very stubborn, would not do it. But she would always tell us how lonely she was. So lonely that she would have the Meals on Wheels guy eat lunch with her so she could talk to somebody. So just kind of hold that thought for a minute. We're going to flip over to Grandma Ermel, who also lived a long life. She lived to be 106. The difference is Grandma Ermel and her husband moved to a senior living community in their 70s because he had some health concerns. Unfortunately, he did pass away 5 years later. But Grandma Ermel, she flourished. She loved being there. She hosted wine and cheese. She had tons of friends every day to talk to. And she also lived a healthy life until she didn't at 106. So I share those 2 stories along with my mother's diagnosis just to tell you that's why I've been in senior living so long. And because I know the difference in the 2 grandmas, I do know that senior living is a wonderful thing that we sell and we talk about. So I want to start by asking you a couple of questions. Why do you feel like we need to be more memorable today in this new normal than we have in the past? And with the current pandemic, how are we taking our presentation skills and we make those memorable, and more so when we're only using screen time? When you think about it, we present every day in many ways. We have seminars, events, appointments with our prospects. We have board meetings, civic and community events. We have phone calls, critical meetings where we might even be providing a report, and even doing a training is a presentation. So as we think about making ourselves more memorable or memorable at all, it's critical for us to feel natural. We want to make people smile and laugh, feel at ease, and fully engage. Maybe even lose themselves in what we're talking about, especially when we're talking about the senior living lifestyle. That's why it feels so unnatural and awkward when we have to talk in a way that we never have before. This virtual screen feels very different to us. So with our time together today, I want to talk about how we're going to better engage and be more memorable through this virtual way of presenting. A dynamic presentation is an impressive presentation. We can become much more dynamic in our busy world today if we simplify things, and I do that through the rule of 3. Now, the rule of 3 is it's a classic writing principle that may be slightly imbued with magic. It states that ideas, or even a story like I just talked about, when it's presented in threes, are more memorable to the listener. If you think about Hilda, Edna, and Irma, my threes, think of those things in our culture that we utilize. So think about things like stop, drop, and roll, 911, and even the beginning, the middle, and the end when we're doing storytelling. So our rule of three today, we're going to start with the first one, creating a compelling structure. I can't tell you enough about practicing every time you want to present something. And once you get the presentation down pat, you're smooth sailing. But until you get there, you have to practice, practice, practice. The second is just keeping it simple. What we want to do is we want to take the complex and we want to make sure that people that are watching us for a short time on the screen are able to take some takeaways and things that they want to retain by having it presented simple. And the third one is we have to keep people engaged. This audience is different. They're not seeing everything that they would see in person. So we know that if we chunk it into these three things, that people will have a better memory. They can recall a simple 3, but they can't always recall when you get above 4 and 5. So we want to make sure that we provide that recall in a simple manner. Let's start with the first rule of 3, never sit down. This is really important when we're presenting any practice for our presentation to a live audience, but I'm going to recommend that you might want to do this even when you're giving a virtual presentation and you're gearing up for that. You should stand and get comfortable with your content, which helps us. If we are able to stand and really move a little bit, we can retain that content better, and it helps us to feel more comfortable, which is important. If you take this and you wrap the structure around it, so really the structure of all this is to begin by setting the stage for our practices. You want to simulate the conditions of your presentation as closely as you can. My example of that is Olympic swimmers. They don't practice in kiddie pools, so you shouldn't practice sitting in a recliner with a box of cookies. So we really want to do it with the equipment we're going to use the presentation that we've created, and then set that stage. A couple things to do while you're setting that stage is taking notes as you practice. If you have a place that's sticky and you need to go over and over it, make a note of that. Setting a goal for the time. If you have a goal for your time and you practice within that time, it's going to make you more comfortable because you're more flexible while you're presenting. Recording yourself. None of us like to do that. We don't even like to hear our voicemail recordings. But I would say at least one time, record yourself so you can really pick up on what you are doing in your delivery style. Carefully observing yourself and giving yourself some constructive critiquing. You want to be comfortable, and the only way we get comfortable is knowing what works and what didn't. Background noise. When we're giving a virtual presentation, it's so different than being in a room with people. We have dogs barking, babies crying, neighbors mowing, whatever it is, we want to make sure that that background noise is very minimal. And my last point here on this slide, which is a pet peeve of mine, is the people that use ums, you knows, okays with a question mark. So instead of doing those things, if you can practice and hear yourself, then put a pause where you typically would use those kind of phrases. And we want to make sure that we go over all the sticky parts, which would include ums, you knows, and okays. The rule of 3, let's go with another 3. What do we practice? Well, of course, we have the areas of body language, vocal tone, and content. So I'm going to elaborate a little bit on each one briefly. The essential part of how you appear to your audience, even on a computer screen, is your body language, especially if you're on camera. If you're doing a one-on-one with a prospect or a lead, you definitely want your hand gestures, your movements, your posture, your facial expressions. You want all of those things to be as confident and as you can be sure in that screen. So we know that we naturally get a little nervous, and especially when we're doing these kind of Zoom meetings for the first time, and that can be distracting. So just get in a comfortable position using minimal swaying and movement. I've seen a lot of presentations where people are looking up at the other screen that they're maybe have two screens, or they're getting really close and we see an eyeball roll around. So just knowing that those things can happen, you want to get comfortable with that. I think you get the picture on that one. Your vocal tone is very critical. We don't want to be monotone, and we're really looking into a PowerPoint presentation, not seeing people. So we have to keep inflection in our voice, and we have to be engaged not only with the body language, but the vocal tone. That's really a big portion of what we're doing, is presenting our enthusiasm, and that comes through importantly in our tone. If you control your voice before you start, it's really helpful. So one trick to that is to take some deep breaths. It's just like breathing control helps us when we're doing workouts or sports or those kinds of things. The same thing here. You need to warm up a little bit. And since you're using your voice, those deep breaths really help us to control our voice as we go into our presentation. The third part of this one is the content. Most people think of getting ready for a presentation as they have to memorize it. I'm going to suggest that if you familiarize yourself with it, your content will mean more. If you know it backwards and forwards, you're going to have a natural ease of presenting that information. It won't be robotic like if you've tried to memorize it. If you engage with the content and just don't drill through the PowerPoint and read off your slides, they're going to remember what you said much better. This is another most important addition to the content piece, is what we call the pause. Heard about it, I'm sure. The pregnant pause. The pause gives the impression that it will be followed by something significant. So I would suggest you consider building silence into your talks and let the words speak for themselves. It's really important to make people anticipate what you're going to say. The rule of three, number 2, keep it simple. We want to choose 1, 2, tops 3 bullets on a slide. It's more important what you say about those points than it is to put it all up on the screen, because they're going to be looking at your information, trying to read while you're talking. So they're not listening to what you're saying, they're trying to read before you change the screen. So just keep it simple, hit the main points, and then narrate what you mean about those points, so that when you leave that screen, they're not thinking, well, what was all that about? And I missed it. I didn't hear what she said, and I couldn't read the whole thing quick enough. So you don't want to leave them in doubt. Number 2, use easy and simple visuals. As you can see from my 2 examples, the word puzzle is really not a good one to use because it's just hard to read. It doesn't really speak to what you're speaking to. And it's just as an example of how you don't want to put something up that's too busy, as well as the graph. It's very difficult to read graphs that have too much information. For consideration, if you put a large and difficult spreadsheet up on the screen, do you think people are going to really take the time to look through it and then remember it? Probably not. The third one here is to associate a message with an image. Use a lot of photography, graphics. Anything that is simple and clear that goes along with your message is going to be something that they'll remember from. The third one is that we do want to engage our audience. I once had a professor in college in a speech class that stated, when you're giving a presentation, you should imagine everyone in the audience sitting in their underwear. Well, that was totally distracting to me. I could never really make that visual work. So if you look at these 2 pictures I have on the screen, whether you're speaking to the audience on the left, who would be a challenging group to get them to engage with you, or the audience on the right, who is ready to go. They've got their glasses on, they're tuned in, they're all focused. They would be the ideal audience to have. But your goal is to be memorable by getting their attention, but also by keeping it. So to avoid scary scenarios, which this could be in this photo, you have to set an image, perhaps to talk with somebody directly. I learned this technique from Oprah Winfrey, who at one point said that when she first started in the business, she would look into the camera and just see the camera. So she had to imagine herself looking at her best friend and talking to that friend. I would recommend the same thing, where you find a person in your mind that you're wanting to share some really good information with. I want to tell you about what I do at my job, and here's how I'm doing it. And you're really able to relate to that person, and it takes away the scariness of that bigger crowd. So I also do that same thing. So the fear of virtual presentations is really more realistic than giving a person-to-person presentation. In real presentations, we do see people that we can talk to and relate to, and we use body language. And with these virtual presentations, we don't have that. So as a result, you end up speaking into kind of a void. You're not getting any feedback. Your brain does not get that feedback it needs, so it creates all kinds of scary scenarios, kind of like this vision that you're seeing here. So with our new normal, I believe this is going to become our regular normal in the future. We're pivoting from this audience to this audience, our screen audience. Assure your settings are always appropriate with your screen audience. So you want to make sure that you're turning on the right components, that the microphone is either on or off, whatever is important to you. Maybe going through, if you're using Zoom as your modem, that you understand all the bells and whistles to Zoom, and there are quite a few of them. As I mentioned earlier, we had a great presentation on all of the Zoom characteristics at Greystone this morning, which was very helpful. But you do want to assure that all your settings are appropriate. Another tip when you're talking to a group like this on screen, just to bring more of that human touch to the screen, use the word you, as if you're speaking to that one person that you would like to be talking to out there. An example would be, instead of saying, can everyone see, implying that there's a lot of masses out there, use, can you see me? Or can you see the screen? It's a subtle difference, but it goes a long way in a virtual presentation. And on the other side of that, we do a lot of work with our sales teams, and so we want to change that a little bit. When we're doing that kind of a presentation, we want to talk about we, because that's a different group, and we would want to address them as we. Another tip, just to talk about how this differs, is compared to being in an in-person meeting and presentation, we want to start 10 to 15 minutes early, preparing and being ready to go on screen. I mentioned earlier I had some technical difficulties on Tuesday. So when my presentation started, it was spot on 1 o'clock, and I was still talking to the IT guy. So this one today went much better because we started very early and made sure everything was working in plenty of time. So I'd rather be 5 minutes ahead than 10 minutes behind. Always better. I started my presentation today with the tale of the two grandmas. I use that personal story when I do give presentations to prospects and family members, just because it relates to them on a personal note. It also has a compelling message about the difference between the two ladies in that 30-year span of their lives. One was lonely for 30 years and one was engaged and happy. All the difference was those two locations they lived in, one versus a senior community versus living at home where she'd been for 50+ years. So as we get into telling a story, we know that we also have to get to the point. It's always important to not go down a rabbit hole, but keep those stories succinct and on point and easy to remember. Another quick start to engage in is to start your presentation with a question for a quick audience engagement. You may use that question and then pause, because you don't really have an interaction with the audience, but you can still give them that pause that's so important before you go on and present something really important. I'm going to share another little quick story. When I'm doing presentations for our communities, and it's either doing priority presentations or conversions or whatever it is, it's kind of fun. I use a slide with George Burns, and I put this slide up there with his quote, "You can't help growing older, but you can control growing old." So then I ask everyone simply at the beginning of the presentation, after putting that slide on the screen, is anyone here old? Well, that tends to make lots of laughter, and there's always one lighthearted person in the group that raises their hand, gives us a funny one-liner, and that breaks us into that memorable experience together at the very beginning. So I suggest that no matter what you're presenting, try to engage at the beginning. Of course, that question helps, but engage with that story. Somehow get them to personally relate to the information that you're going to be sharing. I call this a star moment, something they always remember. So if you have your star moment, it's going to engage around that story that you've shared. So I'm going to wrap up today and just share with you a couple thoughts that really tie into what I wanted you to remember out of today. The key takeaways that really are similar to one of the best presenters that we've seen over the last decade or so, and that's Steve Jobs. If you don't know who he is, he's the co-founder of Apple Computers with Steve Wozniak. Under his guidance, we saw all kinds of pioneering with just revolutionized technologies. They included the iPhone and the iPad. I remember watching Steve present the iPad, and it was so memorable because he really came down to the basics of the iPad by saying the three things. It was thinner, it was lighter, and it was faster. These three adjectives were all people needed to know. So I will tell you one thing about Steve Jobs. He was a presenter who practiced 200 times before opening a new Apple product with his company. But his style was fewer words, no matter how long the topic was. And he really did give his audience permission to show enthusiasm for what he was doing. Because if you're not excited about what you're talking about, nobody is. So here's a few facts that he used in all of his presentations. He kept his slides uncluttered. He used large font. He made that complex simple. And his belief, practice, practice, and keep on practicing. So I'd like to leave you with this one last thought, and then we'll take a few questions on our chat room. Just be memorable with the last rule of three. What you're going to be doing is going to be informing, inspiring, and overall entertaining. That's how we become memorable. It's when we practice those threes, the rule of threes right there. So now I'm going to stop sharing my screen, come back on. Here we are. And I'm going to see if we have any questions. I don't see them popping up at the minute, but I do have some that were asked earlier that I can add in here. One of our folks had asked, what makes virtual screens more challenging? Well, actually, the things that we kind of covered here today, if you have an audience that you need to keep their attention, you have to be engaging. That's much more challenging than if we're in a room with people face to face and on point. And you can't always tell how you're doing, so you have to keep going during the meeting or the presentation. So that makes it a little more challenging. Number 2 question, how do you overcome technical difficulties? Well, I certainly had that issue on Tuesday. I would suggest that you practice and you use your actual setup. And so practice it as if you're really doing the presentation itself. Be prepared if you can have an IT person available, or just log in early enough that you feel comfortable having all those things in place. You should be in good shape. And if you need a moderator, if you're doing a large webinar, you want to make sure you have somebody that can wrangle all those chat room and those questions. The third one, how do you resonate remotely all the time? If you're doing this kind of presentation, how do you keep that excitement going? Keep your slides simple so you have room to talk and be excited and not worry about hitting every point on your slide. Look directly into the camera. Don't be distracted by another screen or wherever you're at, something in the room. And use plenty of photos and graphics. I think those help us keep that resonation going all the time and keeps our audience stimulated. I did have a fun question. Somebody asked, what would you wear? What do you suggest you wear? Well, as you've seen, I saw on the news the other day, one of the broadcasters on the morning show, he accidentally got caught and he had on gym shorts under his jacket and his dress shirt. And it went viral. It was quite funny. So at least make sure that you look appropriate from the level of your screen on up. and you don't necessarily have to dress up. I would be casual and yet comfortable. I think we do have a question here, just came up. It says, what should you do if no one joins? Well, I would be prepared there. Great question from you, Jill Janes. I would be prepared to just run through some information, and whether you've got anybody out there or not, I know I get this experience on investor calls. A lot of times we have these investor calls, and sometimes investors don't even join, but it's being recorded for Emma, so we have to go on and give our report. Same thing, just do it. Just do it like you've got an audience. That would be my answer to that. Okay. Here's a question. Do you think it's better to leave your own camera on or off when giving a presentation? You know, that's a really tough one, and I think we've had all kinds of webinars with people looking at the camera and delivering their presentation, or people going off. Personally, I get distracted watching myself or watching the screen around me, so I like to turn it off during the presentation and then have it come back on. But if you're going to do it, it's like I said earlier, please look at the camera. Don't watch yourself, which is a real easy thing to do. Okay, I think we have just a few minutes left. I don't know if there's any more questions. I know the other day we stopped and we had a couple questions come in after we stopped, so I'm going to give it one more minute. And while we're waiting, I am going to give you a reminder that next week, the Greystone webinars are going to feature Tim, who's going to talk about eBlast. So unlike mine today, there's a lot of webinars that have demonstrations, and those are great because you can kind of follow along and really see people demonstrate. So I think you'll appreciate seeing the eBlast, how it helps save time and budget next week on May 5th and 7th at 1 p.m. Mine was a little different today. I don't really have anything to demonstrate other than my stories. So that's what I shared with you today. So I think that we're good to go. I don't see any other questions coming in. Let me make sure. Okay, I'm not seeing anything else. So I thank you for joining me today. We're wrapping up right on time, and I hope you go forward, have great presentations, and make sure you're memorable. Thanks for joining. Have a great day.